Derbyshire, November 1816. The first frost of winter had settled across Wycliffe Manor like a benediction, transforming the ancient estate into something from a fairy story. Through the tall windows of the morning room, the gardens lay silver and still beneath a sky the color of pearl. Every blade of grass jeweled with ice that caught the weak November sunlight and threw it back in 1,000 tiny rainbows. The ancient oaks that lined the drive stood sentinel in their winter sleep, branches etched black against the pale sky, and somewhere in the distance a crow called out, sharp and lonely. Miss Dorothea Finch sat in her customary chair near the fire, positioned with the precision born of 5 years of practice, close enough for warmth but carefully angled so as not to obscure the heat from her employer. Her hands, roughened slightly from helping in still rooms and organizing household supplies when servants fell ill, held a leather-bound volume whose gilt lettering had long since worn away. The novel was dreadful, truly dreadful, full of swooning heroines and impossible rescues and declarations of love that bore no resemblance to anything that existed in the real world. But the Dowager Lady Wycliffe adored such nonsense with a passion she usually reserved for arguing with her solicitors, and Dorothea had learned over 5 years of service that her employer's preferences in literature, as in absolutely all things, were absolute law. "More feeling, child," Lady Wycliffe commanded, without bothering to open her eyes, one papery hand waving vaguely in Dorothea's direction. At 76, the Dowager remained as formidable as the manor itself, all sharp angles and iron will wrapped in expensive black silk and Honiton lace. Her mind was sharp as broken glass, despite what certain hopeful relatives might whisper in London drawing rooms, and she missed absolutely nothing that occurred within her domain. You read as though cataloging estate expenses or calculating compound interest. The heroine has just discovered her beloved alive after believing him dead these 3 months. Show some enthusiasm, for heaven's sake. Where is the passion? Where is the joy? Dorothea swallowed against the tightness in her throat and began the passage again, injecting false passion into her voice, while her mind insisted on wandering to the very real estate expenses that awaited her attention later that afternoon. The accounts would most certainly not balance themselves. She could almost feel the phantom scratch of the quill against the parchment as she mentally reviewed the columns. The steward had made yet another error in the timber calculations, underestimating the volume by what appeared to be nearly 30%. He had calculated in cubic feet but misapplied the conversion from the raw loads. Left uncorrected, the mistake would cost them hundreds of pounds, possibly more. She would need to review the figures again, recalculate everything with fresh ink, and then find some diplomatic way to present the corrections to Mr. Chadwick without wounding his pride so severely that he tendered his resignation. Again. Managing an elderly steward's dignity while preventing his incompetence from bankrupting the estate required a delicacy Dorothea had not known she possessed until necessity forced her to develop it. Rather like the mathematics itself, come to that. She had never imagined at 19, fresh from her father's funeral and her mother's subsequent rapid decline, that she would one day spend her evenings teaching herself advanced calculation from dusty texts in a nobleman's library. But life, she had discovered, cared nothing for one's imagination or preferences. Life simply happened, relentless and unforgiving, and one either adapted or drowned. She had chosen to adapt, though some days the effort felt rather close to drowning anyway. It was then, as she stumbled over a particularly purple description of the hero's smoldering gaze, that everything changed irrevocably. If stories of love discovered in the most unlikely circumstances touch your heart, subscribe now and join us on this journey. You will not want to miss what happens next. The butler entered with unusual haste. His composure fractured just enough that Dorothea marked it immediately. "Your Grace, Lord Silverton's carriage has been spotted approaching. He was not expected until next week." Lady Wycliffe's eyes snapped open with satisfaction that made Dorothea's stomach sink. "Excellent. Earlier than anticipated, but no matter. Dorothea, Cease that dreadful caterwauling and go change into the blue gown. The gray makes you look consumptive. Your Grace, I do not understand. Why would I change for Lord Silverton's arrival? He has never noticed my presence in 5 years of quarterly visits. Because, you foolish child, tonight you meet your future. And I will not have you looking like a governess when you do so. The book slipped from Dorothea's nerveless fingers. My future? Your Grace, I truly do not comprehend. Lady Wycliffe stood with surprising vigor, crossing to where Dorothea sat frozen. She placed one papery hand under Dorothea's chin and lifted it, forcing eye contact. Her gaze was penetrating, almost pitying. Do not play coy with me, girl. You are marrying my nephew. I have decided it, and though he will resist initially, being the stubborn fool his father raised, he is an intelligent man and will see sense eventually. The world tilted dangerously. Dorothea's voice came out barely above a whisper. Your Grace, I cannot. This is not possible. His lordship does not even know me. I am your companion, not a suitable bride for a Marquess. The idea is absurd. Precisely why you are suitable. You are genuine, intelligent, and kind. You know these estates better than any steward I have employed. You have saved me thousands upon thousands of pounds over 5 years by correcting investment errors and managing what I am supposedly too senile to handle. You have been invaluable to me, Dorothea. Most importantly, you love him already. Do not look so shocked. I have eyes. I have watched you watch him these 5 years, thinking yourself unobserved in corners and doorways. He needs someone who loves him for himself, not his cursed title and fortune. Tears burned hot in Dorothea's eyes. He will be humiliated, Your Grace. He will hate me. I am nobody. Please, I beg you, do not do this. Already done. The announcement will be made at dinner tonight. Now go and change that dreadful dress before I burn it myself. Dorothea fled, her vision blurred with tears, her heart hammering against her ribs like something wild and desperate for escape. In her small attic room, she sank onto the narrow bed and pressed her face into her hands, trying to control the panic that threatened to overwhelm her completely. She had been invisible for so long. It had been survival. Learned through necessity after her father's death, left her family destitute, and her mother had followed him to the grave within a year, dying of shame and a broken heart. At 19, Dorothea had been a week away from the workhouse when Lady Wycliffe had offered her the position of companion. 5 years of careful self-effacement, of making herself useful but never noticed, of protecting the fragile peace she had built from the ruins of her former life. And she had watched Lord Damien Coleridge, Marquess of Silverton, during his quarterly visits to his aunt. Watched and, God help her, fallen impossibly in love, despite knowing it was the height of foolishness. He was everything she could never have. Wealthy beyond measure, titled powerful, moving through the world with the unconscious grace of a man who had never known want or desperation. And yet there were moments, brief flashes, when he thought himself unobserved, when his mask of cold aristocratic control slipped and she glimpsed the man beneath. The way he spoke gently to elderly tenants, the coins he slipped to footmen at Christmas, believing no one noticed. The books he read late at night in the library, philosophy and poetry, not the political treatises one might expect. She had no illusions about her own worth. 26 years old, plain, penniless, the daughter of a disgraced viscount who had gambled away everything, including his family's good name. Her auburn hair was unfashionable, her figure fuller than society preferred, her face scattered with freckles that no amount of lemon juice could fade. She had made peace with spinsterhood, had found dignity in service, had taught herself to want nothing more than what she had. But Lady Wycliffe had just shattered that careful peace completely. Downstairs in the drawing room, Lord Damien Coleridge, Marquess of Silverton, stood before the fire and tried to control his temper. His aunt sat in her usual chair, looking remarkably pleased with herself, which immediately made him suspicious. You summoned me with an urgent letter claiming you had selected my bride and would tolerate no further delays. His voice was ice, the tone he used in Parliament when particularly displeased. "I am here, grandmother, and I am waiting for an explanation of this presumption." "Presumption?" Lady Wickliffe's eyebrows rose. "I am 76 years old, Damien. I am not immortal, and you are 34 with no heir and no wife. Someone must take action, as you clearly will not. I am not a horse to be matched at your whim. I will choose my own bride if and when I decide to marry, which I have not. You have that ridiculous list of requirements: intelligence, character, capability, honesty, genuine affection, rather than social climbing. I have found you precisely what you claim to want. You will thank me eventually." Damien stared at his aunt, cold dread settling in his stomach. "Who?" "You will meet her at dinner, and you will be civil, Damien, or I swear by all that is holy, I will disinherit you and leave everything to charity. Do not test me on this. I have already had the papers drawn." He opened his mouth to argue, saw the steel in her eyes, and closed it again. 1 week. He would give her 1 week to see reason, and then he would return to London and his ordered, controlled life, where elderly relatives did not meddle in matrimonial matters. Dinner was announced, and Damien offered his arm to his aunt with frigid courtesy. They entered the dining room, and he looked around expecting to see some suitable aristocratic lady waiting. The room was heavy with silence. Not a peaceful quiet, but a suffocating weight that pressed against the chest. The servants stood like statues, eyes averted, sensing the impending storm. Miss Dorothea Finch, his aunt's companion of 5 years, stood beside the table wearing a blue gown that did nothing to disguise her humble station. She was pale as death, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles showed white, her eyes fixed on the floor as though she wished it would open and swallow her whole. "Grandmother, who is this?" "This is Miss Dorothea Finch, Damien, your intended bride. The wedding is scheduled for spring." For a long moment, the only sound was the crackle of the fire and Dorothea's shallow breathing. Then Damien found his voice, and it came out laced with contempt he made no attempt to hide. "Your companion? You have chosen a paid servant? Grandmother, this joke has gone quite far enough." Dorothea flinched as though struck, but kept her eyes down. Lady Wickliffe's voice could have cut glass. "Miss Finch is the daughter of Viscount Finch, despite her father's failings. She has managed my estates with a brilliance that has prevented your own inheritance from being squandered during my supposed senility. She is educated, capable, and everything you claim to want in that ridiculous list of yours. She is perfect." "Perfect?" Damien's laugh was ugly. "My list specified a woman of appropriate rank, a woman society would accept, not some indigent relation playing at gentility in exchange for room and board." The words landed like physical blows. Dorothea stood very slowly, trembling from head to foot, and finally raised her eyes to meet his. The devastation in her gaze made something twist uncomfortably in his chest, but he pushed it aside. She had been part of this scheme, surely. Angling for a position so far above her station that it verged on comedy. "Your Grace, I must tender my resignation, effective immediately. I will leave in the morning. Forgive me for the intrusion of my existence into your life, my lord." "It was never my intention." She tried to move past him toward the door, but he stepped into her path without thinking. "You were part of this scheme, then? Angling for a position above your station by using my grandmother's fondness for you?" Something changed in Dorothea's face. The devastation hardened into fury so pure it seemed to burn. When she spoke, her voice shook, but her words were clear and cutting as a blade. "You dare suggest that I orchestrated my own humiliation? That I spent 5 years making myself invisible precisely to avoid this nightmare? I watched you, my lord, from corners and shadows as a good companion should. I watched you argue with your grandmother and then yield when you thought yourself unobserved. I watched you slip coins to footmen at Christmas believing yourself alone. I watched you read to dying tenants and offer comfort. I watched you be a good man that society does not see. I watched you and fell in love despite knowing it impossible." Her voice broke, but she continued, tears streaming down her face now, and Damien found himself frozen, unable to move or speak. "And now you stand here accusing me of ambition when your arrogance blinds you to everything beyond your precious consequence. I had nothing, Lord Coleridge. My father destroyed everything, including my faith in my own worth. Your aunt gave me shelter and dignity and purpose when I was 1 week from the workhouse. I owe her a debt I can never repay. But I will not marry a man who finds the very idea of wedding me absurd. I will not be pitied." She pushed past him and fled, not through the main door, but toward the servants' stairs, her footsteps echoing in the sudden terrible silence she left behind. Damien stood motionless, her words echoing in his head. "Watched you and fell in love." His aunt's voice cut through his shock like a whip. "Well handled, Damien. Quite gentlemanly, reducing her to tears and accusing her of gold digging. I am certain your parents would be so proud." He turned to face her, and for the first time in years felt something uncomfortably like shame. "Grandmother, you cannot expect me to simply accept this. I expect you to honor your word. 1 week, Damien. You promised me 1 week of honest effort, or I will disinherit you completely and leave the estates to a charitable trust. I have already spoken to my solicitor. You would not dare. Watch me. I am 76 years old and dying on my own terms. You have a choice. Spend 1 week genuinely coming to know Dorothea and giving her a fair chance, or lose everything. Your pride or your birthright. Choose now." He was trapped and knew it. He had given his word, and a gentleman's word was inviolate. "She is unlikely to agree after tonight. She will agree because she owes me. Now go and apologize. A real apology, Damien, not some aristocratic nonsense. Humility and honesty, or do not bother." He found her eventually in her attic room, a space so small and bare it made his throat tighten. She was weeping into her pillow, and the sound of it was wrenching. He sat on the floor outside her door, propriety be damned, and spoke through the wood. "Miss Finch, I have behaved abominably. There is no excuse. Surprise and shock do not justify cruelty, and you deserved far better. I am asking, begging you, for 1 week. Let me come to know you truly, not as the companion I have ignored, but as the person my grandmother sees. 1 week of honest effort, and then you decide. If you still wish to leave, I will provide references and a settlement to ensure you are never desperate again. You have my word. I will ensure you are independent and safe, no matter your choice." Long silence. Then the door opened slowly, and she stood there, red-eyed and exhausted. 1 week, my lord. For your aunt, not for you. I love her everything. But understand this clearly. I expect nothing from you. When the week ends, I leave regardless. I will not stay here watching you eventually marry some diamond of the first water while I serve tea and pretend my heart is not broken. I cannot endure that." "Fair enough," he said quietly, and meant it. 1 week to prove I am not entirely the heartless bastard I appeared tonight. Will you at least give me that?" 1 week, she repeated, and closed the door between them. The following morning dawned cold and bright, and Damien found Dorothea in the estate office, going over accounts with a precision that surprised him. She glanced up as he entered, her expression carefully neutral. "My lord, how may I assist you?" "I thought perhaps you might show me what you do here. My grandmother claims you have been managing the estates. I confess I am curious to see what that entails." She studied him for a long moment, then gestured to the ledgers spread across the desk. "These are the accounts for the past quarter. I have been reviewing the timber sales and found a rather significant discrepancy." He moved closer, looking over her shoulder at the neat columns of figures. Her handwriting was precise, mathematical notations in the margins showing calculations that would have baffled most stewards he knew. What kind of discrepancy? The steward underestimated the volume available from the northern wood by nearly 30%, At current prices, that represents a loss of approximately £800. I have corrected his figures using cubic feet rather than his estimations and sent instructions to adjust the sale accordingly. Damien stared at the numbers, then at her. You calculated this? Mathematics is not so very difficult, my lord, when one applies oneself to learning it properly. Your aunt has an excellent library, and I have had 5 years with little else to occupy my evenings. He pulled up a chair without asking permission and sat beside her. Show me the rest. What followed was a revelation that left him feeling distinctly humbled. Dorothea walked him through 5 years of estate management with a competence that exceeded his own steward's work. She had identified and corrected errors, prevented fraud, negotiated better prices for goods, and managed investments that had increased his aunt's income substantially. She knew every tenant family by name, their children, their circumstances, their needs. She had quietly improved cottages, ensured fair treatment, mediated disputes, and created a system of efficiency that would have impressed the most hardened man of business. Why did you never tell anyone? He asked finally, stunned by the scope of what she had accomplished. Why let my aunt take all the credit? Because, my lord, a companion is meant to be useful, not acknowledged. I was grateful for the work, for the purpose it gave me. I did not require recognition. That is absurd. You should have been managing these estates openly, receiving proper compensation for work of this caliber. She smiled, but it was sad. A woman of 26, with no connections and no fortune, does not receive such opportunities, Lord Coleridge. I took what was offered and made the best of it. That is how one survives. He found himself looking at her properly for the first time. Really looking, not at the companion who faded into corners, but at the woman before him. Auburn hair caught the morning light, turning it copper and gold. Green eyes held intelligence and something else, a deep well of strength forged through adversity. Her face was unconventional, certainly, scattered with freckles across her nose and cheeks, but there was character in it, beauty of a kind he had not been trained to recognize. She was not fashionable, but there was something compelling about her stillness, her quiet dignity despite everything she had endured. Tell me about yourself, he said suddenly. Not the accounts or the estates. Tell me about Dorothea Finch. She looked startled, then wary. There is little to tell that would interest you. I doubt that very much. Please, we have a week. Let us use it honestly. So she told him, haltingly at first, and then with growing confidence, about her father, a good man who had fallen into gambling and destroyed his family through weakness rather than malice, about her mother's death from shame and grief, about the terror of being 19 and facing destitution with no skills and no protection, about Lady Wycliffe's offer arriving like salvation when Dorothea had been measuring her possessions against what might buy her one more week before the workhouse. She spoke of books she had read, philosophy and science and poetry consumed in stolen hours, of teaching herself mathematics because numbers made sense when the world did not, of the satisfaction she found in solving problems, in making order from chaos, in being useful to someone who valued her work, if not her person. And as she spoke, Damien found himself leaning forward, drawn in despite himself by the quiet passion in her voice when she discussed ideas, the wry humor that emerged when she felt safe enough to let it show, the fierce intelligence that had been hidden behind years of learned invisibility. Why did you make yourself invisible? He asked when she fell silent. You are extraordinary, Miss Finch. How did I never see you? Her smile was bittersweet. Because, my lord, I perfected the art of invisibility over many years. Companions are meant to be seen but not noticed, useful but not acknowledged, necessary but never important. I have been a ghost in your peripheral vision for 5 years, but perhaps I wanted to remain unseen as well. Why would you want that? Because seeing me meant acknowledging the impossibility of what I felt. It was easier to remain invisible than to hope for things that could never be. Hope is dangerous when one has so very little to lose. The words hung between them, honest and raw, and Damien felt something shift in his chest. Something uncomfortable and unwelcome that felt dangerously like the beginning of genuine feeling. The week progressed in a manner that surprised them both. Damien found himself seeking out Dorothea's company, drawn by her sharp mind and sharper wit. They walked the estate grounds, and she introduced him to tenant families he had met a dozen times but never truly known. Mrs. Ashfield and her 5 children, the youngest born after her husband's death in a farming accident, surviving on Dorothea's quiet intervention that had secured them the cottage and a small income. Old Thomas Marbury, who had worked Wycliffe lands for 60 years and whose rheumatism Dorothea treated with remedies she had learned from an herbal in the library. The Kingswell family, whose eldest son showed promise as a scholar and whom Dorothea had been secretly tutoring in Latin and mathematics. "You have been doing all this?" Damien asked as they walked back toward the manor, the November air sharp in their lungs. "Managing the estates and caring for these families and asking nothing in return?" "They are good people who deserve more than circumstance has given them," Dorothea said simply. "I had the ability to help, so I did. Is that not what we owe to those in our care?" He thought of his own estates in Lincolnshire, managed by efficient stewards who saw tenants as numbers in ledgers rather than human beings with names and stories. "You shame me, Miss Finch. You make me see how little I have truly paid attention to what matters. You have responsibilities I cannot imagine, my lord. Parliament and politics and managing a marquessate. I do not presume to judge." "Perhaps you should. I think I would benefit from your judgment more than I have benefited from my own in recent years." That evening, they sat together in the library, a room Dorothea clearly knew intimately. She pulled books from shelves without hesitation, showing him her favorites, arguing philosophy with a passion that made her eyes shine. When she switched effortlessly into Latin to quote Cicero, he laughed with genuine delight for the first time in years. "Where did you learn Latin?" "Here, from your aunt's library. I taught myself over several years. It seemed a shame to let all these beautiful texts sit unread simply because I was never given a classical education." She paused, then added with careful casualness, "I have been working on a translation of Lucretius. It is purely for my own amusement, of course. No one would publish such work from an unknown woman." "May I see it?" She hesitated, then retrieved a worn notebook from behind other books on the shelf. The pages were covered in her neat handwriting, Latin text on one side, an English translation on the other, with annotations showing her wrestling with particularly difficult passages. Damien read a page, then another, his respect growing with each line. Her translation was elegant, scholarly, capturing nuances that more famous translations missed. "This is remarkable work, Miss Finch, truly remarkable. You have a gift." Color rose in her cheeks, and she looked away. "You need not flatter me, my lord. The week will pass regardless." "I am not flattering you. I am stating fact. You have been wasted here, hidden away, when you should have been at Cambridge or Oxford debating with scholars. It is criminal. Women are not permitted at universities, as you well know. This is as close as I will ever come to that life. But I am grateful to have it. Many women have far less." He wanted to argue, to rage against the unfairness of a world that would hide such brilliance in an attic room and call it charity. But her expression had closed, as though she could not bear to want things that remained forever beyond her reach. The crisis came on the 4th day, sudden and devastating as November storms always were in Derbyshire. The river that fed through the estate rose overnight, swollen with rain from the moors, and by morning had breached its banks and flooded the lower tenant cottages. Damien woke to shouting and organized rescue efforts immediately, but the estate steward had been thrown from his horse the previous day and was bedridden. Chaos descended as everyone tried to help, and no one coordinated the effort. Dorothea appeared in the midst of the confusion, assessed the situation with one comprehensive glance, and took command with a quiet authority that brooked no argument. She organized teams to evacuate families, designated the old hay barn as temporary shelter, sent servants to gather blankets and food, directed the strongest men to sandbag against further flooding, and managed the entire crisis with military precision. Damien worked beside her for 20 hours straight, hauling families to safety, carrying children through water that rose past his knees, his coat and dignity both abandoned somewhere in the mud. He watched Dorothea wade into water, nearly to her waist, to rescue an elderly woman's cat, the creature being the last link to her recently deceased husband, and hold the bedraggled animal gently while the woman wept with relief. By nightfall, the worst had passed. Families were safe, if uncomfortable, in the makeshift shelter, and the immediate danger was controlled. But the bridge to the main house had been damaged and was deemed unsafe, stranding Damien and Dorothea in the groundskeeper's cottage on the safe side of the swollen river. They sat before the fire, exhausted beyond speech, covered in mud and river water. Dorothea had lost her bonnet hours ago, her hair falling loose around her shoulders, and she had never looked more beautiful to him. Not beautiful in the conventional sense that society prized, but fierce and capable, and wholly herself. "You saved lives today," he said finally, his voice hoarse from shouting instructions. "You were extraordinary." "We saved lives," she corrected, not looking at him. "I simply organized what needed doing." "No, you led. I provided muscle, but you provided everything else: strategy, calm, competence, courage. I have been blind, Dorothea. Willfully, deliberately blind, because seeing you meant something I was not prepared to face." She turned to look at him then, firelight catching in her green eyes, turning them gold. What did it mean? He moved closer, drawn by something he no longer wanted to resist. "It meant risking a heart I locked away 11 years ago. It meant vulnerability I swore never to allow again. It meant wanting something beyond duty and control and the careful emptiness I have built around myself. It meant falling in love when I had convinced myself I was incapable of feeling anything at all." Her breath caught. "Do not mock me. That cruelty is too much to bear. I am not mocking you. I am terrified. I am 34 years old, Dorothea, and I have spent more than a decade building walls to keep the world out and the pain locked in. Then you stand there covered in mud, holding a rescued cat, looking like Boadicea herself, who waded into danger without hesitation to save what others would have dismissed as worthless, and something cracks open in my chest that I believed sealed forever." He took her hand, feeling her tremble. "When I was 23, I was engaged to Lady Eliza Ashbrook. Beautiful, accomplished, everything society claimed I should want. 1 week before I intended to propose, I overheard her laughing with her mother. She said, 'Poor besotted Silverton actually believes I love him,' as if she would marry for affection when the Marquess of Lindley had twice the fortune and actually knew how to smile. But Silverton's title was adequate, and he was so easily managed." His voice went rough with remembered pain. "I swore that day never to be vulnerable again, never to love again, never to risk feeling what I felt in that moment, realizing the woman I adored thought me a useful fool. I built walls, Dorothea, tall and thick and strong, and convinced myself I was safer inside them. Then you, with your brilliant mind and fierce heart and refusal to be diminished by circumstances that would have destroyed someone weaker, you have undone every defense I built. You terrify me. The thought of loving you terrifies me. But the thought of not loving you, of returning to London and my empty existence and never seeing you again, that is unbearable." He paused, looking towards the window where the storm still raged. "We are stranded here tonight. I know what this means for your reputation. By morning, you will be compromised in the eyes of the world. Honor demands that I offer you marriage now, regardless of our feelings." He turned back to her, his gaze intense. "But I do not wish to marry you for honor. I wish to marry you because I cannot imagine my life without you. I want you to choose me, Dorothea, not because you must, but because you wish to." Tears streamed down her face, tracking through the mud on her cheeks. I am afraid too, Damien. Afraid you will realize I am not enough. Afraid the novelty will fade and you will remember I am nobody. Afraid to hope when hope has cost me so dearly before. You are not nobody, he said fiercely, framing her face with his hands. You are everything. Everything I did not know I needed. Everything I was too blind and proud to see. But I understand the fear. I carry the same. Promise me we will be afraid together? Together, she whispered, and then his mouth was on hers, desperate and seeking, tasting mud and salt tears and something indefinably sweet. She kissed him back with equal hunger, 5 years of suppressed longing breaking free, and they clung to each other before the fire, while outside the river raged, and inside something new and terrifying and precious took root. When they finally drew apart, both breathless, he pressed his forehead to hers. 1 week, you said. The week is not yet over, but I know my answer. Do you know yours? Yes, she breathed. Yes, Damien. I love you. I have loved you for 5 years from the shadows, and I am so very tired of hiding. Yes. They returned to Wycliffe Manor the following afternoon, once the bridge was deemed safe enough to cross. They were holding hands, filthy and exhausted, and obvious to everyone they encountered. Lady Wycliffe took one look at them and smiled with such smug satisfaction that Damien nearly laughed, despite everything. Well? You were right, grandmother. As always, I am marrying her. Of course you are. I told you she was perfect. But their happiness was short-lived. That evening, as they sat together in the drawing room making tentative plans, the butler announced unexpected guests. Lady Victoria Huntington and her mother, the Marchioness of Westbridge, swept in with claims of Christian charity and concern about the flooding. It was a transparent lie. News traveled through the aristocracy faster than plague, and someone had gotten word to them about Damien's impending engagement to his aunt's companion. They had come to sabotage, and they wasted little time in beginning. Lady Victoria was everything society considered beautiful. Blonde and willowy, accomplished in all the right ways, connected to half the peerage. Her mother, the former Lady Ashbrook, was the mother of Damien's long-ago almost fiancé, and she had been angling for a connection between their families for 3 years. She was also one of the most vicious women Damien had ever encountered, cruelty dressed in silk and false sympathy. Dinner was torture. Lady Westbridge dominated conversation, highlighting her daughter's accomplishments with surgical precision. Victoria had sung for the Prince Regent himself. Victoria spoke fluent Italian and had studied with a famous master. Victoria had been presented at court and had danced twice with the Earl of Somewhere Important. Victoria was connected to everyone who mattered, everyone, such an asset to any gentleman fortunate enough to secure her affections. Dorothea sat silent through it all, her composure perfect but her eyes wounded. Damien tried repeatedly to steer conversation back to include her, asking her opinions on estate matters and current events, but Lady Westbridge deflected every attempt with practiced skill. "Miss Finch," Lady Victoria said sweetly over dessert, her smile never reaching her cold blue eyes. "I understand you are from the north? How charming that you have found such comfortable circumstances here despite your family's difficulties. One must find security where one can, I suppose." The insult was wrapped in sugar, but it was still an insult. Dorothea's voice remained steady. "My family's difficulties taught me the value of honest service. Not all of life's lessons are pleasant, but they are lessons nonetheless." "How philosophical," Victoria replied, her laugh like breaking glass. "One must find consolation wherever one can, I suppose. How fortunate that Lady Wycliffe values such philosophy in her household." "Miss Finch requires no consolation," Damien said, his voice carrying clear warning. "She has earned the respect of everyone in this household through her actions during this week's crisis. Actions that demonstrated courage and competence I would wager exceed any accomplishments displayed in London drawing rooms." The silence that followed was electric. Lady Victoria's mask of sweet charity cracked just enough to show the venom beneath. Lady Westbridge's eyes narrowed in calculation, reassessing the situation. When the ladies retired to the drawing room, leaving Damien to his port, the attack began in earnest. Dorothea would have fled to her room, but Lady Wycliffe had subtly positioned herself to block that escape, forcing Dorothea to sit and endure. "Dear Miss Finch," Lady Westbridge began, her voice dripping false concern, "I could not help but notice the particular attention Lord Silverton paid you this evening. How interesting." "His lordship is kind to everyone in the household," Dorothea replied carefully. "Is he? How curious. His reputation in London is quite the opposite. Cold, they call him. Unapproachable. The ice Marquess. Yet here you seem to be warming him quite effectively. One wonders what techniques a humble companion employs to capture a Marquess's attention so thoroughly." The implication was clear and disgusting. Dorothea felt hot color flood her face, but kept her voice level. "I have employed no techniques, Lady Westbridge. I have simply been myself." "How charming, and how effective, apparently." The Marchioness leaned forward, her expression sharpening. "But I wonder, my dear, have you considered what happens when the novelty fades? When his lordship returns to London and to society, to his natural milieu and his proper circle? When he remembers that Marquesses do not marry companions, however temporarily fascinating they may be?" She let the words sink in like poison, watching Dorothea's face with satisfaction. "I have known Damien Coleridge since he was a boy. I knew his parents. May they rest in peace. I assure you, Miss Finch, that whatever attentions he has shown you stem from nothing more than boredom and gratitude for your assistance during the crisis. When he returns to himself, to his true self and proper station, you will be forgotten as completely as yesterday's newspaper. It would be kinder to yourself to accept that now, rather than suffer the greater humiliation later." Dorothea fled. She could not help it. The words burrowed into all her deepest fears and uncertainties, and she ran from the drawing room toward the servants' stairs, tears blinding her. She made it to her attic room and collapsed on the narrow bed, pressing her face into the pillow to muffle the sound of her weeping. She did not hear the door open, but suddenly Damien was there, kneeling beside the bed, his face fierce. "What did they say to you? Tell me exactly what they said." Through sobs, she repeated Lady Westbridge's words. When she finished, he pulled her up to face him, his hands gentle despite the fury in his eyes. "Listen to me very carefully, Dorothea. That woman told you lies calculated to serve her own purposes. She has been angling for me to marry her daughter since Victoria debuted 3 years ago. She would say anything, do anything to destroy what she perceives as competition. Do you understand? She is protecting her schemes, nothing more." "But she was not wrong," Dorothea whispered. "I am nobody. I have nothing to offer you. When you return to London, to your real life, you will see that." He kissed her fiercely, almost desperately. "She was entirely wrong. You are the only person in this world who makes me feel truly alive. You see me, Dorothea. Not my title, not my fortune, not the cold exterior I show the world. You see me and you love me anyway. Do you have any comprehension how rare that is? How precious?" His voice broke slightly. "I spent 11 years avoiding precisely this moment because I could not find anyone worth the vulnerability, worth the risk of being hurt again. But I found you. When I imagine my future, you are in it. When I think of my life without you, it becomes unbearable. Marry me, Dorothea. Not because my grandmother demands it, not because of duty or obligation or any other cursed reason. Marry me because I love you desperately and cannot imagine facing the rest of my life without you beside me." "Yes," she sobbed, throwing her arms around his neck. "Yes, yes, I will marry you. Not for security or escape or any practical reason. I will marry you because I love you, have loved you for 5 years, will love you the rest of my life." They clung to each other in her tiny attic room, aristocratic propriety abandoned completely. Two people who had found each other against impossible odds and refused to let go. But Lady Westbridge was not finished. The following morning, she requested a private audience in the morning room, claiming to have urgent information regarding Miss Finch. When Damien entered, followed by Lady Wycliffe and Dorothea, Westbridge produced a sealed letter with a triumphant flourish. "I felt it my duty to warn you, Lord Silverton. I have received correspondence regarding your intended. It details a history of calculation and manipulation that I believe you should see before making a mistake that will ruin your family name." She handed him the letter, which contained twisted versions of Dorothea's estate management, making her sound calculating and mercenary. It detailed every kindness Dorothea had shown tenants as evidence of public manipulation. It painted a picture of a cunning, desperate woman willing to do anything to escape poverty, using an elderly lady's affection and a lonely man's vulnerability for purely selfish gain. The humiliation was designed to be complete. Dorothea sat frozen, unable to defend herself against such malice. Lady Wycliffe looked ready to commit violence, but even she seemed uncertain how to counter such direct accusations. Then Damien stood. He did not raise his voice. He did not have to. When the Marquess of Silverton spoke in that particular tone of cold, aristocratic command, people listened whether they wished to or not. "Lady Westbridge, you have made a grave error. Allow me to explain precisely why." He gestured to the butler, who brought forward a leather case Damien had clearly prepared in advance. From it, he drew out documents, ledgers, and letters. He began to methodically dismantle every accusation with evidence, presenting his case like the barrister he had once studied to become. These are the estate accounts for Wycliffe Manor over the past 5 years. They document a significant increase in income and a dramatic decrease in waste and fraud. Miss Finch accomplished this while receiving credit for none of it. If she were the manipulative schemer you describe, surely she would have demanded recognition and compensation. Furthermore, I have here letters from tenants written over 5 years, addressed to an anonymous benefactor they believe to be my aunt, praising improvements to their cottages and education for their children. I have confirmed that every one of these kindnesses came from Miss Finch's own initiative and often her own small income. She has been secretly helping people who could do nothing for her in return. He placed the documents on the table before Lady Westbridge, the sound heavy in the silence. These are financial analyses that prevented investment fraud that would have cost my family thousands. These are solutions to problems that baffled paid stewards, provided freely without expectation of reward. He turned to face Lady Westbridge directly, and his voice went dangerously quiet. "You dare call this woman a manipulative servant? You dare humiliate and degrade someone who has been silently saving estates while my aunt and I took all the credit? You dare suggest she is calculating and mercenary when every action she has taken has been in service to others, with no thought for herself?" He looked at her with clear contempt. "This woman you have attempted to destroy is extraordinary. She is brilliant, capable, kind, and worthy of admiration from anyone with the sense to recognize true quality. Your so-called evidence is the pathetic attempt of a desperate woman to destroy someone who threatens your daughter's prospects simply by being herself, by being genuine, intelligent, and deserving of respect." He turned finally to Dorothea, and his expression softened completely. He dropped to one knee before her, ignoring the gasp from Lady Westbridge, and took her hand. "Dorothea, I am asking you publicly before these witnesses, not because I need to rescue you, but because I need you. I need your intelligence and your honesty, and your strength and your partnership. Will you be my Marchioness, not as my inferior, but as my equal? Will you be my wife not out of duty or obligation, but because we love each other? Will you?" The room had gone utterly silent. Dorothea looked down at him through tears that blurred her vision, at this proud, controlled man kneeling before her in declaration that made him as vulnerable as she felt. Her voice when she spoke was clear, despite the tears. Yes, yes, Damien, I will marry you. Not for your title or your estates or escape from poverty. I will marry you because I love you desperately, because you see me truly when the world has tried to make me invisible, because together we are better than either of us could ever be alone. Yes. He stood and pulled her into his arms and kissed her before everyone, propriety be damned. There was no applause, only a stunned, reverent silence. Lady Wycliffe smiled with deep satisfaction. And Lady Westbridge, pale and defeated, realized that against such absolute conviction she had no power left. She withdrew from the room in disgrace, her scheme exposed and her influence shattered. News of the incident spread through society with predictable speed. The Ice Marquess had chosen an invisible companion over diamonds of the first water, and had publicly destroyed social climbers with evidence and eloquence. Opinion was divided between those who thought him mad and those who found the entire affair wildly romantic. But no one, absolutely no one, questioned Dorothea's worthiness again after Damien's comprehensive defense of her character and capabilities. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of preparation. Lady Wycliffe insisted on a trousseau that would silence any remaining gossips, though Damien pointed out he would marry Dorothea if she wore a flour sack. They argued pleasantly about wedding details, discovering the joy of learning each other's preferences and habits. He taught her to waltz in the ballroom, holding her close and making her laugh when he deliberately led her wrong. She showed him her translations and was astonished when he arranged to have them published by a serious academic press. They talked for hours about everything and nothing, making up for 5 years when she had been invisible and he had been blind. The wedding took place in late March of 1817 at Wycliffe Manor's small chapel. Damien had insisted on intimacy rather than ostentation, wanting the day to be meaningful rather than a social spectacle. Dorothea wore a gown of ivory silk, elegant but simple, with her auburn hair dressed with wildflowers from the estate grounds. She walked down the aisle toward the man who had learned to see her, whose hands trembled slightly as he took hers, whose eyes held such fierce love that her own vision blurred with happy tears. The vows were spoken with unwavering conviction. When the vicar pronounced them married and Damien kissed her, it was both tender and possessive, a claiming and a promise. They emerged from the chapel as Marquess and Marchioness of Silverton, but more importantly, as partners who had chosen each other freely and completely. The years that followed transformed Silverton Hall from a monument of wealth and consequence into a genuine home. Warmth and laughter replaced cold elegance. Children came, 4 of them over the next decade, 2 boys and 2 girls, all with auburn hair and sharp minds that reminded Damien daily of their extraordinary mother. Dorothea proved to be as exceptional a marchioness as she had been a companion, managing their vast holdings with competence that impressed even the most skeptical, but remaining authentically herself, intelligent and direct and unafraid. Damien consulted her on everything, political decisions and financial matters and estate problems, recognizing that her judgment strengthened his own. They became known as an unusual couple, the Marquess who actually loved his wife and showed it openly, the Marchioness who managed estates and published scholarly translations and refused to be bound by society's limited expectations of aristocratic ladies. Some disapproved, many more admired. They faced difficult times together, griefs and setbacks, and the endless pressures of their position. But they faced them as partners, their bond strengthened rather than weakened by adversity. They learned that love was not simply the passionate beginning, but the daily choice to see each other truly, to value each other completely, to build a life that honored both individuals and their union. Lady Wycliffe lived to see her great-grandchildren, dying peacefully at 82, with satisfaction that everything was exactly as she had planned it. Her final words to Damien were characteristically smug. "I was right, as always. Tell your wife I expect proper acknowledgement of my brilliance in the family histories." 7 years after their wedding, On a golden afternoon in autumn, Damien and Dorothea walked through the gardens at Wycliffe Manor, while their children played nearby under the watchful eyes of nursemaids. They were visiting to tend Lady Wycliffe's grave and ensure the estate she had loved remained well managed. Their hands were linked with the easy intimacy of long marriage. "I was blind for 5 years," Damien said suddenly, watching their eldest daughter help her younger brother climb a tree. "Willfully, deliberately blind." "You were scared," Dorothea replied, squeezing his hand. "Understandably so. Hearts that have been broken learn to protect themselves. I almost missed you, almost threw away every chance at happiness because of pride and fear and sheer stupidity. The thought of how close I came to losing you still terrifies me." She stopped walking and turned to face him, reaching up to touch his cheek. "But you did not miss me. That is what matters. You looked eventually. You saw me. You chose me. And you have chosen me again every day since. That is not stupidity, my love. That is courage." He pulled her close and kissed her there in the garden, where their children could see, not caring who might be watching. "I would choose you again every day for the rest of my life. You saved me, Dorothea, from coldness and loneliness and the half-life I had built around my fear. You taught me to truly live again." "We saved each other," she corrected softly. "You gave me back my voice and my worth and the courage to be seen. We healed together. That is what love does when it is real and true and strong enough to weather everything life brings." They stood together in the fading light, two people who had found each other against impossible odds and built something precious from the ashes of their separate sorrows. Behind them, their children laughed and played. Before them lay decades yet to be lived, challenges yet to be faced, joys yet to be discovered. But they would face it all together, partners and equals, seeing each other truly and loving each other completely. And in her grave nearby, Lady Wycliffe surely smiled with satisfaction, knowing that her interference and determination and absolute certainty had given two deserving people the chance at happiness they would never have found alone. Sometimes, she had always believed, love needed a firm push from a formidable woman who knew better than the fools involved. And she had been right. She had always been right. Thank you so much for staying with us until the very end. If this story of love found in unexpected places touched your heart, please like, subscribe, and share it with someone who believes in second chances. Your support helps us continue bringing you stories of courage, dignity, and love that transforms everything.